broadcasting from studio, room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. Welcome back as we prepare together for this revised AP comparative exam on May 22nd. Welcome back. We are making our way through the units, particularly the units that we've been told are particularly important to get you ready for the content. We're making our way through Unit 3. And on Friday, the last day, we looked at political culture. Now we're going into a really hefty topic. You're going to see a lot of core concepts as we tackle political ideologies, political values, and political beliefs. I've written an FRQ that I think could easily get you prepared for some of the content and some of the skills for the quantitative analysis question. But there's a lot of content. I would definitely encourage you to take some time to go back, review some of the vocabulary that I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through it rather quickly. But there's also so many examples that I would invite you to share on, particularly on social media, Twitter at our hashtag. So I'm Andrew Kinane. I teach at Stevenson High School in the north suburbs of Chicago. I want to welcome you back. And of course, you know that I really encourage you to download the AP Comparative course description. That's available at your College Board site, or you can go directly to the PDF, or you can go to our website from the two teachers that Mr. Larson put together, Citizen U, a lot of good US government review materials. But go to that hot link for this material, the Comparative Corner. Essentially, it's the course description plus a lot of the supplemental notes that I'm giving you about the different case studies for the 6 different countries. I know a lot of your teachers prepared you studying country by country, which is wonderful. I teach thematically now. I taught for 20 years country by country, but this year I've moved to thematically. So you can read through essentially my lecture notes, if you will, at the Comparative Corner on citizenu.org. I've been pointing you to directions on where you get more information about the exam, the time, the content. So if you have not checked that out, make sure you go to that AP resource. And of course, we always start off with our Twitter shoutouts at hashtag APCompGov2020. Another busy weekend of shoutouts to Mr. Sonnabend at Walt Whitman High School. Down in Maryland. Welcome to you and your students. Thank you for a very nice shout out. And just got a really nice shout out also from Mr. Clark. Thank you. And Mr. Silva Brown making an appearance. Very excited to see Mr. Silva Brown, a terrific AP comparative teacher out in the Bay Area and of California. And he tweeted out a really interesting example from Iran on hashtag APCompGov. 2020, particularly an Iranian teacher teaching remotely. Really interesting insight into policies in Iran and also how Iranian schools are tackling COVID-19. So make sure you check out Mr. Silva Brown's example at our hashtag. If you want to give a shout out to a teacher, if you want to give a shout out to classmates that you miss collaborating with, or if there's particular content, please use our Twitter hashtag. I know I promised a couple students I would score their FRQs. I got a little bit behind scoring a lot of my students' FRQs for class, so I will definitely get in there. So thank you for our continued interaction on social media. Please keep that up, some terrific interaction and examples that you're putting out there at the hashtag. So I want to give you a preview today of how I'm essentially going about writing an FRQ to try to help prepare you both for the content and the skills. I'm taking you back to some data that I presented to you in Unit 1, particular to some of the data that in the course description, you are told that you should be aware of, including per capita GDP, and then also you should be aware of neoliberalism. We'll talk about what neoliberalism is more today. We've mentioned it as part of Unit 5. You're going to see today where there's a direct connection with neoliberalism and neoliberal policy. And I really think that word neoliberalism opens up the door to using a lot of potential data, particularly economic data, for really good, interesting, free response questions that you should try to be prepared for. So I'm going to show you an example of this later in the lesson, but consider that word neoliberalism. What do you remember about neoliberalism? What do you remember about neoliberal policies? And I'll really point that out in the lesson where kind of this, it opens up a lot of possibilities for different content and skills, particularly the data and arguments for that matter, that you could be prepared for. So today we are looking at topics 3.3 and 3.4, political ideologies, values, and beliefs. We connect this a bunch to democratization, a topic that we looked at in Unit 1. And you'll see also tomorrow we tie it into political participation. And so that's a clear link with democratization. We will be making our way through Unit 3. We're actually going to be wrapping up specific content from Unit 3 by Friday, this Friday. And then I'm going to go into a short review for each of the 5 units. And of course, continue doing practice questions for you, and particularly trying to link each of those 5 units into content, particularly when we go into units 4 and 5 again, to link it back to content that could be fair game, content from units 1, 2, or 3 in this revised AP comparative exam for 2020. So what you need to know, I always start each of the lessons off with critical vocabulary or concepts that are highlighted in a way. They're not physically highlighted in the course description, but as I read through the course description, my eye always goes to vocab and concepts that I want to get my students prepared for. So as I go through topics 3.3 and 3.4, there's no shortage of essential vocabulary that you should really be a master of right now, or build your mastery and your understanding of these vocabulary. And a lot of these come from 3.3 when we look at the political ideologies that are listed and described in the course description. But then when we go into political values and beliefs, that really is where it opens up a lot of potential for FRQs and quantitative analysis. And I'll point that out as we go through. So political ideology, again, if you're taking AP US government, you'll be familiar with that. But then we get into some other ideologies that are more specific referenced in AP comparative, including individualism, communism, socialism, fascism, populism. We'll do a contrast again. I know we've tackled this before between rule of law and rule by law. You see an appearance of the vocabulary word welfare state in this unit, and also this word post-materialism, which catches a lot of students by surprise. And I'll try to give you an example of what is post-materialism and a policy in a lot of the countries that we study in the 6 countries. So political ideology, here's a really good example of when you're asked to, and you probably won't be asked to define, you won't be asked to define a word with the way that these questions are structured in 2020. But it's never a bad idea to, if you're asked about a word, particularly in the quantitative section, to be able to demonstrate that you understand what that word is. And many times, I think the way you can do that is with an example. So that's tailor-made in the course description today, because you're supposed to know that a political ideology is a set of values and beliefs about the goals of government. A shorter way to understand this is a political ideology is a set of beliefs about what you think the government should do, what policies the government should enact. That contradicts with political culture that we looked at in the last lesson, because political culture are more ideals. It's commonly held beliefs about what people think or how they think their government should operate. So the more general principles. But when it comes to actually doing something and passing a policy and enforcing a policy, that's where we get political ideology, the set of beliefs about what government should do in terms of policy and politics. So the first ideology we're given by College Board is individualism, which is a belief in the protection of civil liberties, freedoms. We didn't put in there, probably private property is a major freedom. That's part of individualism. Another ideology is neoliberalism. And again, I think this word really is a very broad and flexible word that can incorporate Free market ideas. If you're studying AP US government, you see a lot more reference to the term free market for neoliberal. We see in later units in comparative, a synonym for neoliberalism is market forces. And we also see that in Unit 5, there's a lot of references to neoliberal policies when it comes to economic globalization. And sometimes we call another synonym for neoliberalism is economic liberalization. So there's a number of different concepts that connect with neoliberalism. There's a number of different synonyms. The one from Unit 3 that kind of opens up the door to a lot of these different policies, from free market policies and economic liberalization policies, is that word neoliberalism. And essentially this is free trade. It's less government regulation of the economy. It's fewer rules for corporations and industries to follow. It's lowering taxes, so less government regulation, less taxation, as a way to let market forces work more in terms of shaping economic outcomes. So it's a whole complicated set of policies and arguments and data that all center on that word neoliberalism. So it's a really essential word that I think you should be prepared for. And you'll see my attempts to write some questions related to neoliberalism later in this lesson. So communism, we are told, and I should point out, if you're new to these lessons, that anytime I put an asterisk next to a definition or notes, that means that that definition or that description of the word or those notes are coming directly from the AP comparative course description. So it's a helpful way to see that in some cases, I'm kind of adding my supplemental notes or ideas on the topic, like I did with neoliberalism in the second paragraph without the asterisk. But anything that does have an asterisk is coming from the course description. So communism is the belief in the abolishing private property, with the government in near total control of economic decisions. Socialism is the belief of reducing income disparities, with the government taking over more industries, maybe not all the industries, but more of the industries in what we call nationalization, where the state or the government is more in control of those economic decisions and those industries. Fascism is this extremely nationalistic ideology. You tend to see, well, you do see authoritarian rule. Certainly in Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, you saw totalitarian rule, and certainly a priority of the ethnic majority over that of the ethnic minorities are what characterize fascism. And then populism is this idea of moving towards the issues of the common people. In many cases, populism is more conservative or more traditional social policy, but also mixed with some government benefits, and in some cases, more government initiated economic decisions. And populism, you oftentimes see populist politicians playing up nationalism, but also playing up the idea of common people over the elites. So that's what characterizes the ideology of populism, and the definition comes straight from College Board. Now, when we're contrasting ideologies, it is important to note that particularly when we're looking at democratic and authoritarian governments, oftentimes the course description is asking us or asking you to understand the difference between rule of law as opposed to rule by law. And remember, rule of law is this idea that the law matters, that everybody in that particular country or jurisdiction has to abide by the same laws that are transparent, and they have to abide by the same laws in the same capacity, in the same ways. So that no matter whether you're in the elite or the common people, that the law is going to apply to you equally in terms of who gets prosecuted by the law, the extent of the punishment of those who are prosecuted by the law, that there's a consistency and equality in terms of how the law affects every individual in that particular district or country or jurisdiction. That's rule of law. And that's in rule of law characterizes a more democratic regime in terms of this equal treatment by the law. Rule of law insinuates that it's a more authoritarian government that's using the law in an unequal way, and that it's an authoritarian government that's using the law or the power to prosecute or the power to punish in a way that targets a particular group of people, and specifically targeting a specific group of people in a way that keeps the government or keeps the regime in power, so that there's not a consistency, so that those in power are much less likely to be targeted if they violate the same laws as the common people. That's more of a rule by law. And I've mentioned this a couple different ways in particular to these countries. And so some of these examples might sound familiar to you. The one I use commonly is with China, which is a more authoritarian government where we know they're very serious about tackling corruption in any government in China, but particularly under the presidency of Xi Jinping, the current president. There's been a notable rise in the prosecutions of corruption, of corrupt political officials and business officials, particularly from those officials who might be opposed or not fully endorsed by President Xi and his allies. And so the name of that group in the Communist Party that actually is in charge of that investigation and punishment is the Central Commission for Discipline and Inspection. And already you've seen some really notable, in some cases, these are powerful people who are targeted, but they tend to be selectively targeted. So there's a notable billionaire who just last week was known to be under investigation. And coincidentally, this billionaire in China is under investigation, but at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis in China, he was very critical of President Xi's leadership of the crisis. And now this billionaire finds himself under investigation. And so that's how rule by law can work, that it's targeted against those who might be opposed to the regime or critical against those in power. So you see struggles with this in a lot of our countries, particularly in Mexico, with Pemex being the national oil company. When you're controlling a large company, where typically you have incredible revenues, except when oil is below $5 a barrel, as if you follow that news today, there's enormous potential for corruption. And certainly Pemex is one of those big companies where there has been corruption, and there's been kind of varying degrees of prosecution by the government against some officials. And so that's where, even in a country that's moving towards democratization, like Mexico and Nigeria, you see some struggles with the consistency of how laws apply to the elites. You see that in a lot of different countries. Again, another example of rule by law that your teachers might have talked to you about when studying Russia is the case back in 2004. So it's over 15 years ago, but Mikhail Khodorkovsky was Russia's richest person at that time in 2004. He had the controlling interest of Russia's largest oil company. But when he spoke of challenging President Putin for power early in Putin's administration, Mikhail Khodorkovsky quickly found himself being investigated by authorities, under trial, served almost 10 years in prison. His company was taken away. The company ended up being acquired back and centralized by Russia's government. And it can be an example of how the courts of Russia were used as a way to target a political opponent to President Putin. Again, more of an example of rule by law rather than rule of law. So political beliefs associated with authoritarian regimes tend to rely on rule by law, like I was mentioning before. And then a supplemental note, authoritarian regimes are more likely than democratic regimes to employ agents of political socialization that help shape political beliefs. I was talking about that last week as well. And so some examples where you see kind of the government using rule by law, and particularly in a more authoritarian way, to shape political beliefs. Look no further than Xinjiang, the province in China, northwest China, that has a predominantly Islamic population, where the government has used a lot of coercion and forceful coercion to shape political socialization, to reduce the sentiment towards separatist movement in that province in China, to reduce religious liberties, to take more control over the practice, particularly of Islam, in that particular province of China. So that's where you see that, an example in China. Very similar in Iran, particularly after the 2009 election protests, what's commonly called the Green Revolution, or much more recently this fall and into early 2020, where there are a lot of citizens in Iran protesting economic policies that were leading to an increase in gas prices in Iran before COVID-19 hit Iran very harshly. You saw the government come in with a lot of forceful coercion, a lot of violence to crack down on protesters. You saw some leaders of the movement imprisoned in 2009, still under detention. And so that's where you see a more authoritarian approach to shaping political socialization, this idea that, you know, some dissent, a lot of dissent that goes against the government wishes is very notably put down with force and in some cases violent coercion. In more democratic regimes, you tend to see, of course, there's coercion. You can have rules against anarchy in protests in any government. But in a more democratic government, you would see a more consistent and more even protection of civil liberties towards all groups that might be protesting or speaking out. So you see that consistency where it's not just certain groups that are targeted by the government in a more rule of law democratic system. So you would see that particularly in the United Kingdom, where in 2010, there were major protests against the government's budget cuts, what we call budget austerity cuts. And there was some police violence in response to those protests, but you also saw, it was notable that in a more democratic system, that protesters who are injured by police or law enforcement authorities are given more latitude and more power to file litigation, to file lawsuits, and to try to get compensation for injuries in a more democratic government if the law enforcement crosses boundaries. Hybrid regimes like Russia are trickier because certainly Russia allows more protests than China does, but we also know that those protests that do go against Putin oftentimes face harassment by government officials, are more likely to face coercion rather than a protest that's, you know, in favor of the government, which you see in Russia commonly. And so that's where you see that unequal treatment that makes Russia more that hybrid regime, where there's very inconsistent application of civil liberties, even though there is some more ability for dissenters or political opponents to protest in their system. In this note, we know that beliefs about social and economic equality can be held by citizens in both democratic and authoritarian regimes, but are contrasted by the amount of enforcement responsibility transferred to the government to protect their health and material well-being. And this is particularly where you see a reference in the course description to this term welfare state. And so welfare state, we're starting to get into some of that economic policy that goes into political values and political beliefs. And the definition I provide for welfare state is that welfare state is a government that takes responsibility for providing key social services such as healthcare. So we see an example of this in the United Kingdom with the National Health Service, or governments, and all 6 of our governments have some form of public education available. In some cases like China, it's mandated that all students go to government schools. That can be part of the welfare state. Housing, we know that different countries have different policies providing government housing and retirement benefits. So a way you can think about this, a way you can contrast this, is to contrast the United Kingdom with China. And certainly the United Kingdom has government housing, but they provide government housing for a smaller proportion of their citizens than China does. And we know that both of the systems have national healthcare systems. And when you look at China, what's interesting is that both the United Kingdom and China had a lot of state-owned enterprises in the 1960s and 1970s. And in the 1980s, both of the countries tried to move towards more of a privatization. So these state-owned enterprises where the government controlled the industry, much more likely to provide retirement benefits, housing benefits. And in China, that was known, still is known as the Iron Riceball. It's the idea that if you work for a big state-owned enterprise in China, you're being provided with not just healthcare, not just education, but also housing, in some cases stipends for food, and retirement benefits. And so you're kind of locked in. The Iron Rice Bowl are these locked in. Maybe your wage is really low, but the government's providing a lot of services. So with these state-owned enterprises, we know that Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and Deng Xiaoping in China in the 1980s were trying to move both countries into less government control of these state-owned enterprises, into kind of a direction of more privatization and allowing more foreign direct investment into those what had been state-owned enterprises. We know that the United Kingdom was much more effective at privatizing much bigger parts of its industries. So industries like the airways or telecommunications, the coal mines is a big example from Britain, moved into private control in the United Kingdom. So you now see those, the energy industry, telecommunications, the airlines under private control. And so you don't have those guaranteed government benefits to the workers in those industries. China certainly went through some privatization, but let's not embellish this, particularly after the Tiananmen Square student protest. China really backed off its privatization, particularly of those state-owned enterprises. China still controls all of the steel, all of the energy and gas. China, even the state-owned enterprise produces, they're the tobacco company. So you've seen much less movement compared to the United Kingdom in terms of privatization, even though there was that initial movement to do that in the 1980s. So you see different degrees of privatization, of kind of trying to change the degree of the welfare state in both of those countries. When we get to the topic of post-materialism, this is where it's really interesting to compare countries and their policies. So post-materialism, the definition we're given in the course description is the social valuing of self-expression and quality of life that leads to applying pressure on governments to address environmental issues, social and economic equality. And essentially, a way to describe this is after a country is finding economic success, it might be moving more into debating policies, post-material policies. And the example I use in class for this are LGBT rights as it applies to different countries that we study. So for instance, the United Kingdom used to have laws against same-sex relations and would punish men and women if they were caught in same-sex relations. But we know that particularly over the last 20 years, and particularly in the last 10 years, we've seen the United Kingdom go so far as to legalize same-sex marriage as it applies to England. Regional governments in Scotland and Wales have also legalized same-sex marriage. Although that region of Northern Ireland, again, because of devolution in the United Kingdom, in some degrees, there can be variance in the policies. And it's notable that Northern Ireland, while you can have same-sex civil unions in Northern Ireland, same-sex marriage has not been legalized in Northern Ireland. Okay, but that's the status of some LGBT rights in the United Kingdom. And contrast that with a country like Russia that has legalized same-sex relations. You can serve openly as a gay man or lesbian in the Russian military, that's allowed. But same-sex marriage is one of those issues that particularly President Putin has made a note that they have not legalized. Russia has passed what's called anti-gay propaganda laws as a way for the government to monitor websites and use technology to monitor with the contention of trying to restrict LGBT rights on the internet. And even if you look at the proposed constitutional changes in Russia, there's a possibility that amongst those proposed changes could be a constitutional provision, if it's approved, that would make same-sex marriage illegal under Russian law. So you see some degree, again, with gays and lesbians being able to serve in the military, some degree of gay rights and LGBT rights. When it comes to gay pride parades and same-sex marriage, many of Russian policies are very restrictive of those rights. And then you contrast that in Iran. We know that same-sex relations are prohibited. In some cases, the punishment can be particularly harsh, including the death penalty for gays and lesbians. But we also know, quite interestingly, that since the early 1980s, in terms of transgender rights, there have been some transgender activists who have appealed to the Muslim clerics of Shia Islam to allow the government to subsidize transgender reassignment surgery, with this idea that according to Sharia law, and the interpretation in Iran of Sharia law by some of these Muslim clerics, that if a man is homosexual, that the government could provide gender reassignment. And that's one of the ways that Iran has addressed the issue of homosexuality and transgenderism in Iran. So those all would be what we would consider post-materialist policies of LGBT rights, and the very different way that three of our countries handle LGBT issues. So if you know of particular agents or examples of particular values in the AP6 countries, I'd welcome you to put those out on social media, hashtag APCompGov 2020. We always go into some practice questions, some multiple choice, and then the FRQ that I was hinting at before. So in this case, quick multiple choice question, which of the following concepts is a set of beliefs about the goals of government? In this case, you should know that that lines up with political ideology. These get a little bit more complicated, which is a correct pairing of definitions. So we have political ideology on the left and political culture on the right. And hopefully you remember that political ideology is the collection of beliefs about what government should do with policy, whereas political culture are the collective beliefs about how government should operate. How about comparing ideologies? We have individualism on the left and socialism on the right. And hopefully hone in on letter B, that individualism is the belief in individual civil liberties, the protection of those liberties and freedom, while socialism is the belief in more nationalization of industries in order to reduce income disparities. And to contrast neoliberalism and communism in this case. And hopefully it didn't take you long to get into letter A, that neoliberalism, more limited government intervention in the economy, what we call free market, or communism, the abolition of private property. We got one more comparison between governmental control over economic systems. I was mentioning this before, the difference between Thatcher in the 1980s and Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. Again, this is not a history class, but in some cases, if you know some historical examples, it can make some of these concepts a lot more understandable, including this one, in which case that in the United Kingdom, government still provides healthcare with the National Health Service, but almost all large industries have been privatized. But you see the government in China much more influential in controlling major industries. Okay. As I was mentioning before, this is the time where I give you an FRQ and I try to model how I would suggest one way that you could write the FRQ, but really highlighting some of the mechanics that I think will be helpful for you to maximize points. In this case, I'm again looking at quantitative analysis. Question number 2, you'll have 15 minutes to write this. We think it'll be structured as like an A, B, and a C directions because there are 3 skills. When you look at the AP coronavirus updates, you're going to see that there are 3 skills that are going to be assessed. These are the 3 skills that come right from that page. So the question I'm writing today is structured after those 3 skills that connects with that data set, the table of information that I was showing you before about per capita GDP of 4 of our countries, from the joining of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the most current per capita GDP information that we have for those 4 countries. And the question is a 3-part question, A, B, and C. Explain how a pattern of data in the table demonstrates neoliberalism in China. Explain, using the data in the table, draw a conclusion about sovereignty in Nigeria. Sovereignty is a word that we got from Unit 1. And also a topic or a concept we got from Unit 1 is explain how data in the table relates to power in Russia. I really think with the way that these skills are described in the new update, in the modifications for this question, I think you could see 1, 2, maybe even 3 different concepts highlighted in these 3 different skills. So a way that you're going to have to connect the data to those different concepts that are referenced. And so this is where I really recommend being an expert on those concepts, because that's really where it's going to pay off. When you see the argument essay, there's going to be at least one concept that you're given that you have to connect with the argument. There is going to be one concept in the argument essay, we know that. But in the quantitative analysis, you're also likely to see 1 or more concepts to connect the data to. So I try to structure this question that way. So I have some suggestions on how to do this and some suggestions on what not to do. I did this on the last lesson. In the top part of my answers, I'm answering the way that some of my students might answer, in a really abbreviated way that I'm not quite sure this is going to get the point. And in some cases, I know that's not going to get the point, even though it's speaking to the question. So let me expand. So if the question is, explain how a pattern in the table demonstrates neoliberalism in China. And if you go back to the table, one way to answer this is a pattern in the data demonstrates neoliberalism. I like to repeat the vocabulary of the prompt in China because China has benefited from membership in the WTO. So you know that whenever I see an explain how or an explain why, I really encourage you to use a causal word to demonstrate causation, to explain how, to explain why. So this is not wrong. I mean, there's the pattern in the data showed neoliberalism because China has benefited from membership in the WTO. I don't think that's going to get a point because it's really brief and it didn't use the data. And you need to use the data in order to get this point. So the data is right there. Make sure you use the data. And that's why it says, explain how a pattern in the data, use the data. So neoliberalism, and here's where I also recommend kind of showing off that you know a little bit about the concept that's part of the question. So neoliberalism is a policy of more limited government regulation of the economy to allow market forces to shape economic outcomes. Hopefully you know that a little bit more today. So I just kind of put a summary of the definition in there. And then this is evident in the data because, still emphasizing my word of causation, China's per capita GDP grew from about $1,000 to about $9,700 after it gave up some power to regulate trade policy with its membership in the World Trade Organization. So here's where I really strongly believe that when you're asked to describe a trend or a pattern, as this question is going to ask you to do, you really have to identify at least 2 pieces of data in the data set, at least 2. And that's what I tried to do here, where I contrasted $1,000 with $9,700. I probably should have been more complete and added the years, and maybe I would do that and recommend to add the years. Certainly the years are right there. You can do that. But I do have my 2 pieces of data to show that pattern, and I connect it to the concept of neoliberalism, and I make sure I use a causal word for my explanation. So be more complete. Use that data, and when it comes to a pattern or a trend, use 2 pieces of data. When you're asked to draw a conclusion, again, I think when you see the phrase draw a conclusion, you should assume that means I have to explain how or explain why. So that same rule would apply. Use a word of causation: because, due to, therefore, since. So again, I tried to show you 2 examples, one less complete and one more complete. Based on the data in the table, conclusion about sovereignty in Nigeria could be that Nigeria benefited from giving up some sovereignty over its trade policies since its per capita GDP increased with membership in the WTO. So again, I think that answers to the question. It's a conclusion about sovereignty, that when you join the WTO, you do give up some sovereignty, some power over your trade policies. And I do reference that Nigeria's GDP, per capita GDP, did increase with membership in the WTO. Use the data. It's there. Be specific with it. And so you can see my second example, that's what I tried to show you, to be more specific in a similar answer. A conclusion that can be made based on the data in the table is that Nigeria's per capita GDP rose from $264, in this case I did put the year, to around $2,000 because Nigeria gave up some sovereignty over its trade policies after joining the WTO. And so I think combined, that's a really solid answer where I know I've now used the data and I've explained. And again, I'm trying to prove to the reader that I know about the word, that they're using the word sovereignty in the question. I want to show off that, yeah, I understand what this word means. Do I have to give a full definition of it? It doesn't have to, but the more that you can demonstrate mastery of that concept, it's going to help you maximize points. So for letter C, explain how data in the table relates to power in Russia. We know that, again, it's going to take a concept. In this case, the concept is power, and you got to connect that to a specific country. And there's a really lousy way to answer that is this first sentence: Russia's power over its economy has decreased since 2011. That's true. That's reflected in the table, but you got to use a causal word, and you got to use specific data. So that's my second sentence, much more complete, much more likely to earn me the point. Data in the table relates to power in Russia because the government didn't have the power or ability of influence in its economy to reverse its economic losses from 2011 to 2018, as evident in its declining per capita GDP from around $14,000 in 2011 to $11,000. So clearly Russia's government did not have the power. I'm actually going to pause this here because I violated one of my key principles, and I think I've referenced this before. I don't like pronouns. I'm going to get rid of the its. I had too many its in there. Of influence in Russia's economy to reverse its economic loss. So I'd like to get rid of some of those its. Let's get rid of this one. A lot of times, if you're using too many pronouns, in this case, it's only asking about one country. But if it's asking about 2 different countries and you're overusing its or the they, and I see this a lot with students overusing pronouns, it becomes very murky what those pronouns are referencing. And I've seen a lot of really good answers that overuse pronouns that all of a sudden you can't keep track of what the it is referencing or the they or the them. And so when you can, try to eliminate those pronouns and use, in this case, Russia is the reference there. So that's another tip I would give you in all of your writing, but particularly in AP free response writing. So we were looking at political ideologies, political values, political beliefs today. Lots of definitions. Make sure you go back and review your vocabulary and those core concepts. And today's topics has a bunch of those core concepts. These connect, you'll see tomorrow, to political participation, topic 3.5. And you've heard me talk about some of these concepts earlier when I was looking at some specific lessons from Unit 5. If you have unique examples of political values and beliefs, feel free to use our Twitter hashtag at #APCompGov2020. And tomorrow we are looking at political participation. Feel free to drop in a reference to your ideal form of political participation. Do you like referendums? Do you like ranked choice voting? Do you prefer more local voting, more national voting? Are you a monarchist and prefer the elites just to make your decisions? What is your preferred form of political participation? Mine is to call and complain. I love that form of political participation, but that's me. So if you have issues with technology, please make sure you reach out by April 24th to College Board by the end of this week, or encourage your friends. And thank you again for tuning in. Tomorrow we proceed through more of topic 3 as we look at political participation. Thank you again for joining us in Room to See, where there's always room to see how countries compare. Be well.